endocrine system is a chemical messenger system comprising feedback loops of hormones released by internal glands of an organism directly into the circulatory system, regulating distant target organs. Today, we will cover 4 topics. First, we will look at hormones. Hormones are messenger molecules secreted by ductless glands. They circulate in the blood and often act on distant target cells. They bind to receptors on the target cells. Based on chemical composition, hormones can be classified into amino acid-based and steroids. Amino acid-based hormones include modified amino acids, peptides, and proteins. Steroids include steroid hormones. Based on solubility, hormones can be classified into lipid-soluble hormones and water-soluble hormones. Lipid-soluble hormones include steroid hormones and thyroid hormones. Water-soluble hormones include peptide hormones and protein hormones. Here's a comparison of 2 classes of hormones. Lipid-soluble hormones have receptors inside the cells. They act as nuclear receptors that control gene transcription. Except thyroid hormones, they are synthesized as needed. Except adrenal androgens, they typically bind carrier proteins. They have long half-lives. In comparison, water-soluble hormones have receptors on plasma membrane. They utilize second messengers, leading to enzyme activation or inactivation. After synthesis, they are stored in vesicles. They dissolve in plasma unbound. They have short half-lives. Release of hormone is controlled by one of the 3 mechanisms: humoral, neural, and hormonal mechanism. Humoral is a response to changes in level of ions or nutrients in the blood, such as the release of parathyroid hormones in response to calcium level. Neural mechanism is a response to stimulation by nerves, such as release of catecholamines in response to stimulation by sympathetic nerves. Humoral mechanism is a response to stimulation by other hormones, such as release of hormones from anterior pituitary glands in response to stimulation by hormones from hypothalamus, and release of hormones from thyroid glands, adrenal cortex, and gonads in response to stimulation by hormones from pituitary glands. Now, let's move to part 2. We will look at endocrine organs in the brain. There are 3 endocrine organs in the brain: hypothalamus, pituitary glands, and pineal gland. Pineal gland secrete melatonin. Today, we will focus on hypothalamus and pituitary gland. This is hypothalamus, and this is anterior, and this is posterior pituitary gland. One of the most important functions of hypothalamus is to link the nervous system to the endocrine system through the pituitary gland. Hormones in the hypothalamus and pituitary glands are all water-soluble. Now, let's move to part 3. We will look at hormones in the hypothalamus anterior pituitary axis. This is the hypothalamus, and these are few nuclei in the hypothalamus. Preoptic nuclei secrete gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Arcuate nuclei secrete growth hormone-releasing hormone and dopamine. Periventricular nuclei secrete corticotropin-releasing hormone, somatostatin, and thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Hypothalamic hormones are synthesized in the neuron cell body, packed in vesicles, and transported down the axon to be stored and released from the nerve terminals. They are transported to the anterior pituitary through minute blood vessels called hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vessels. In the anterior pituitary, these releasing or inhibitory hormones act on glandular cells to control their secretion. In the hypothalamic anterior pituitary system, except thyroid system, hormonal release is mainly pulsatile. Anterior pituitary secretes 7 hormones: TSH or thyrotropin, ACTH, corticotropin, FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. They are summarized here. The first 4 hormones regulate function of other hormones. They are called tropic hormones. TSH stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce corticosteroids. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates follicle growth and ovarian estrogen production in females. It stimulates sperm production and androgen-binding protein in males. Luteinizing hormone controls ovulation and growth of corpus luteum in females. It stimulates androgen secretion by interstitial cells in testes in males. Growth hormone stimulates growth of skeletal epiphyseal plates and stimulates body to synthesize protein. Prolactin stimulates mammary glands to secrete milk. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone stimulates melanocytes to produce the black pigment melanin. Most hormones from hypothalamus stimulate release of hormones from pituitary gland, except 2, somatostatin and dopamine. Release of growth hormone is stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone and inhibited by somatostatin. The fact that eliminating hypothalamic input causes a decrease in growth hormone secretion supports growth hormone releasing hormone is the main controlling factor. Secretion of prolactin is inhibited by dopamine and stimulated by elevated levels of TRH. When the connection between the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary is severed, secretion of all anterior pituitary hormones decreases, except prolactin, which increases. This observation indicates under a normal condition, a default state is constant secretion of dopamine inhibits secretion of prolactin from the lactotrophs. Dopamine is the primary neuroendocrine inhibitor of the secretion of prolactin from anterior pituitary gland. The arcuate nucleus and the periventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus have dopamine neurons that constantly secrete dopamine. Dopamine is secreted into the hypophyseal portal system of the medium eminence. Dopamine inhibits the secretion of prolactin. In the absence of dopamine, the lactotrophs secrete prolactin continuously. As I described to you earlier, hypothalamus links nervous system to the endocrine system. Here, hypothalamus receives inputs from the nervous system. Hypothalamus responds by control release of hormones from anterior and posterior pituitary glands. When the blood glucose level is low, the hypothalamus receives the input and responds by secreting corticotropin-releasing hormone. CRH stimulates pituitary gland to secrete ACTH. ACTH stimulates adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol. Cortisol increases gluconeogenesis in the liver. At the same time, hypothalamus also stimulates adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine through the sympathetic nervous system. Epinephrine increases glycogenolysis in the liver. The actions of both cortisol and epinephrine increase the plasma glucose level. Here is a clinical correlation. Hypopituitarism is this decreased secretion of one or more of the hormones produced by pituitary gland. It can be isolated deficiency or panhypopituitarism. It represents decreased secretion of most or all pituitary hormones. Isolated deficiency includes growth hormone deficiency, which causes dwarfism, and Kallmann syndrome, which is caused by gonadotropin-releasing hormone deficiency. This condition leads to decreased secretion of gonadotropins and sex steroids. On the other hand, pituitary adenomas are tumors that occur in the pituitary gland. Here we use prolactoma as an example. It is a benign tumor of pituitary glands that produce prolactin. Symptoms include no periods in females, loss of axillary and pubic hair, milk production, small gonads, gynecomastia, and erectile dysfunction in males. This condition can be treated with dopamine. Now, let's move to part 4. We will look at hormones from the posterior pituitary gland. Two hormones are derived from preprohormones synthesized in the supraortic nuclei and paraventricular nuclei and stored in the posterior pituitary. One is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. It stimulates the kidneys to reclaim more water from the urine and raise blood pressure and constricts blood vessels. The other one is oxytocin. It promotes contraction of smooth muscle in reproductive tracts, initiating labor and injection of milk from breasts in females. Oxytocin and ADH are released directly from hypothalamic axons into the systemic circulation. ADHs are 9-amino acid peptide hormones. Here is the amino acid sequence of arginine vasopressin. ADH is secreted from the posterior pituitary in response to a reduction in plasma volume and an increase in plasma osmolarity. It has a very short half-life. Here is osmoreceptors and ADH feedback mechanism. Water deficit leads to an increase in extracellular osmolarity, which is detected by osmoreceptors. These receptors send a signal to ADH-producing neurons and stimulate ADH secretion. As a result, plasma ADH levels rise. ADH has two primary functions. One is to retain water in the body. Second is to constrict blood vessels. Let's look at the first function. ADH acts on distal tubular and collecting ducts in the kidney to increase water permeability. This leads to increased water reabsorption and decreased water excretion. Water retention results in decreased extracellular osmolarity. ADH also increases peripheral vascular resistance, which in turn increases arterial blood pressure through V1 receptor in a calcium-dependent pathway. As I have described to you earlier, ADH is synthesized in supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei of hypothalamus. Here is osmoreceptors, and here is supraoptic neuron, and this is paraventricular neuron. ADH is secreted from the posterior pituitary and acts on the distal tubular and collecting ducts in the kidney. Factors that increase ADH secretion include increased plasma osmolarity, decreased blood volume, decreased blood pressure, and drugs such as morphine, nicotine, and cyclophosphamide. Conversely, decreased plasma osmolarity, increased blood volume, increased blood pressure, alcohol, clonidine, and haloperidol decrease ADH secretion. Here is clinical correlation. Diabetes insipidus is a condition characterized by large amounts of dilute urine and increased thirst. Symptoms include excessive urination, extreme thirst, and increased fluid intake. Diabetes insipidus is different from diabetes mellitus because the urine does not contain glucose. Central diabetes insipidus is caused by a defect in ADH production. ADH is not sufficient to affect the renal collecting ducts. Causes can be genetic or acquired. Acquired causes include tumors, autoimmune disease, trauma, sectioning of pituitary stalk, and destruction of the hypothalamus. Central diabetes insipidus is treated with replacing ADH as vasopressin or desmopressin. Nephrogenic diabetes insipidus results from inability of the kidneys to respond to ADH. Usually, plasma ADH levels are elevated. Causes can be genetic or acquired. Acquired causes include lithium, hypokalemia, and hypercalcemia. These three conditions all diminish ADH effectiveness on principal cells in the kidneys. Syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion is caused by excessive secretion of ADH. It causes an inappropriate increased reabsorption of water in the renal collecting duct. Symptoms include increased water retention, hypernatremia, inappropriate concentration of urine with high osmolarity. It may be caused by ectopic production of ADH, use of certain drugs, such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and lesions in the pathway of baroreceptor system. For treatment, apply fluid restriction but not salt restriction.